Glad you're here tonight. We are in the book of Judges. We've made our way as far as the 8th chapter, looking at the life of Gideon. If you have been with us the last couple weeks, we've looked at this incredible time in Israel's history. They had walked away from God. They had worshipped the Baals. And then they went into a time of oppression as a community. They had the Midianites who would come up and literally cause terror across the land. Right at harvest time, they would come and wipe out all of their harvest. They would come and destroy all of their livestock so that the children of Israel continued to be in oppression. And after some time, they finally cried out to the Lord. They finally acknowledged that without God's help, they would continue in the state that they were in. And God seeks out a man by the name of Gideon. Gideon was hiding from the Midianites. It was harvest time. They knew that it was any day now the Midianites were going to make their journey back and do what they did every year for the last 7 years. And Gideon is in a wine press, and it says that he was winnowing the wheat in the wine press. And that would have been an impossible task, because when you winnow, you would throw your wheat into the air. The wind would literally blow the chaff away, and then you would have the substance, the wheat, left behind. But he's doing it in an area that he couldn't be seen, and therefore he had no ability to actually accomplish what he was trying to accomplish. Fear had gripped him, as well as the rest of Israel. And it tells us that in that moment, the angel of the Lord shows up and says, "Hey, Gideon, you mighty man of valor." I can only see, Gideon trying to figure out, who are you talking to? Because you can't be talking to me. I'm living in fear. I'm hiding from the Midianites, and you're calling me a mighty man of valor. And God begins at this point to say that he was going to use Gideon to deliver the nation of Israel. And Gideon, very aware of his inabilities, Gideon just simply says, do you know who you're talking to? I'm the smallest of the tribes, the least in my father's house. I'm a nobody. And you're calling me a mighty man of valor, and then you're telling me I'm going to be the one delivering the children of Israel from the bondage that they're in. And God says, I'll be with you. And he gives Gideon a commission to go out and to fight against the Midianites. But before he's ever sent on the mission, he's given instructions to go to his father's house, to tear down the altar of Baal. That means the idolatry was in his own home. To offer up one of the ox. You go and take your dad's ox. That's not going to be a good day. And throw him on an altar. You see, ox was their working animal. It was like, take the tractor and blow it up. That would have been the equivalent of what Gideon was asked to do. Take the 7-year-old ox, and I want you to use the wood from that altar that you tear down and offer it up to me. And Gideon says, okay, Lord, but let me do it at night so no one can see me. And he does. And it causes an uproar in the whole community. Who tore down, Baal's altar? And his dad acknowledges that it was Gideon. Everyone begins to rat him out that it was Gideon. And then his dad says, let Baal plead for himself. If Baal is going to kill Gideon, then let Baal do it. Let's not us do it. And I think that there's a great principle for all of us. None of us have to defend God. If God's big enough, he can defend himself. And the gods of this world, man, when they get disrespected, they can defend themselves. It's if they're anything. And what's incredible, and you look at this whole picture, is that at this point, Gideon is gained some respect in the community. He goes, he blows the trumpet, and an army amasses around him. 30,000 of them. Not to mention that the Gideonites had about 135,000. And so he's kind of got a little over 4-1 odds against them, but they're going to go and they're going to fight this battle. But before they fight the battle, Gideon goes, Lord, I got to know that this is you. I'm going to put a fleece out. Now, God had already talked to him. He said, Gideon, I'm going to go with you. You're going to win this battle. But God, I want to make sure that this is you. And so he puts a fleece out. He says, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to put a fleece, and that's a thing of wool, a big old pile of wool. I'm going to put it out. And if in the morning the fleece is wet and the ground is dry, I'll know that you told me to do it. And sure enough, the next morning he wakes up and the fleece is wet and the ground is dry. And he goes, no, Lord, don't get mad. Don't get mad. But I just want to make sure, I'm going to put the fleece out tonight, and if the ground is wet and the fleece is dry, then I'll know that you told me to do it. And sure enough, he wakes up in the morning, the ground wet, the fleece is dry, and Gideon is affirmed, that this is God. It wasn't just, some natural occurrence. It wasn't just some accident. That this was actually God leading and God guiding and God directing. And so Gideon's getting ready to go to battle, and God says, wait a second, Gideon, before we go to battle, you got too many guys with you. I know it's 4-1 odds, but if you guys go to battle and you win this battle, you're going to think that you did it. And so I'm going to weed out some of these men. And so God tells Gideon, go and tell the men, if they're fearful, just go home right now. And 20,000 of them leave. They're left with 10. 10,000 men against 130. Now the odds are a little better, 13-1, right? You kind of got like, okay, this is getting for real. And Gideon comes back and says, okay, Lord, we're ready. we got a group 10,000, 13-1 odds. And God says, you know what? There's still too many. If you guys go and you win this battle, you're going to think that you did it. And so God says, I'm going to test them for you. And he has all the men go drink water at one of the brooks there, one of the watering holes. And as they go down to drink the water, everyone who lapped like a dog was separated, 97,000 of them. The ones that had scooped with their hand were put on the other side, 300 of them. And God's going, okay, God got rid of 300 more. Okay, we can do this. And then God says, tell the 97,000 to go home. Now you got 300 men going up against 130,000. Now, if God, you win that battle, it wasn't you. It has to be God. And that's exactly the environment that God works in. Is when it's not you. It can only be God who accomplishes the task. And so God sends Gideon, his 300 men. And, Gideon's still fearful because God tells him, Gideon, if you're still afraid. And Gideon goes, yep, still afraid. He goes, I want you to go down, sneak up on the Midianites at their camp, and I want you to just listen in and what they're talking about. And two of the Midianites are talking to each other, and one of them had a dream that this wheat had come, barley actually, rolled up and devoured the whole camp. And he goes, well, that was a weird dream. I don't know what that dream was. He goes, that was nothing but the sword of Gideon and the Lord, you're going to wipe you guys out. And Gideon heard this conversation. And Gideon goes, man, even the enemy knows God's doing something. And he goes back now, he's going with confidence. And so he goes, man, they surround him with the 300 men. They take their torches, they break the jars. The Midianites think that there's a huge army. They begin to fight against one another and they flee. And that's where we pick up here in chapter 8. Now, it's interesting that the victory is already in full swing. We'll find out shortly that 120,000 of them have already been destroyed. There's only 15,000 left. And Gideon and his 300 men are still pursuing after these guys. They see, God's doing something, man. Let's finish this off. Let's make sure these guys, the Midianites, never gain strength again so that they're able to come and cause oppression to us. And before they ever are able to continue, we find that from within the camp, there becomes a problem. And guys, and I think there's something to this. There's lessons, weaved into all of this. That, when God's doing a great work, it's never the outward, it's the inward that you got to be careful of. It's always from within that the enemy is going to try to cause a division, or the enemy is going to try to cause a distraction, or try to get you off your goal or your purpose or your mission. And it's right here. Notice what happens. And the men of Ephraim, chapter 8, verse 1, said to him, why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight with the Midianites? And they reprimanded him sharply. Now, when Gideon was gathering his army, he never called Ephraim. That was one of the tribes of Israel. And they're upset. They're going, how come you didn't let us in on this, man? And really, it was all about them. Think about this. The 120,000 already wiped out. They're having a victory. And rather than coming alongside and say, man, what can we do? They're complaining about what they missed out on. And Gideon is faced with a leadership decision. How do I handle these guys? How is it that I talk to my own brethren who are, rather than doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're complaining about what they missed out on or what I didn't do, or and it's wild how it's when you have your greatest victories, it seems like it was when the enemy is looking to cause the greatest confusion. And the Ephraimites, the guys from Ephraim, start to, it's interesting. He says they reprimanded him sharply. I mean, these guys are just like, and really it was their own pride that they weren't in on the victory. They weren't able to take some of the proceeds from defeating the Midianites, taking all of their gold and their silver and their all of their stuff. It was jealousy. And so what's interesting is how Gideon responds. Watch what Gideon does in verse 2. And he said to them, what have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has delivered into your hand the prince of Midian, Oreb and Zeb, and what was I able to do in comparison with you? And the anger toward him subsided when he said that. Now, it's interesting. Gideon could have went, who do you guys think you are? You bunch of knuckleheads? I mean, Gideon could have got real defensive here, but rather than get defensive, what Gideon did? He just simply said, look, you guys are already doing a great work. What have I done compared to you guys? You guys caught the guys from Midian. They had captured them, and they had did what they were supposed to do in that situation. And Gideon, rather than getting offended by them, he compliments them. I think that's just wisdom. I love the heart of Gideon. He's like, this isn't about me. This isn't about you guys. Man, let's do what God's called us to do. You guys took out those two princes and man, praise the Lord. God's used you. And he could have got really defensive at this point. I think there's wisdom here. In Proverbs 17:14, it says this: the beginning of strife is like releasing water, therefore stop contention before a quarrel starts. That's a great proverb, isn't it? Just, you just respond back to someone the way they responded to you, and you just start a war. But if you just respond, in kind, say, hey, what, that was never my heart. That was not my intent. And right away, you just threw water on the whole fire that could have started. It's Proverbs 15:1 says this: a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. A soft answer turns away wrath. But you respond harshly, you're just stirring up more anger. And Gideon navigates through a very difficult circumstance from his own brethren. And so he does that, I think, with God's guidance, man. Think about this. Gideon just did all of these things, and these guys are complaining. And Gideon could have really just unloaded on them. But instead he just, what, guys, you guys are awesome. You guys are so cool. Look what God did, right? And he just put the whole thing to rest real quick. But look at verse 4 now. And when Gideon came to the Jordan, he and the 300 men who were with him crossed over, exhausted, but still in pursuit. And he said to the men of Succoth, this was the tribes on the other side of the Jordan, these are also brethren. The tribe of Gad would have been there. Now, 9.5 tribes moved into the promised land. 2.5 of the tribes stood on the other side of the Jordan. And this particular tribe, Gad, is there in Shechem, in that particular part of the Jordan River, right along the Jordan River. And it says, Succoth that is, and that's what he says in verse 5. And he said to the men of Succoth, please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they're exhausted, and I'm pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, king of Midian. And the leaders of Succoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your army? And Gideon said, for this cause, when the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. Interesting. He had a whole different approach with these guys. Right? The first group of guys, that was just their pride, and he knew, what, if I can just get them on my team, man, then we can accomplish great things together. This tribe of Gad had become actually traitors. They were really looking out for their best interests of themselves rather than their brethren. And so Gideon's pursuing these guys. They're exhausted. And I think there's an interesting picture here. These guys had been fighting, and then they had been traveling, a long journey. They were tired. And they come to their brethren and say, hey, give us some bread. Feed us a meal. Let us be nourished, and so we can continue this battle. And because they were afraid if they didn't defeat the Midianites, that the Midianites would be angry with them, and then they would end up wiping them out. And remember, the odds are still 15,000 to 300. And so, they're kind of like thinking, those guys aren't dead yet. And what if you don't beat them? And then they get mad at us. And so, you know what? We're not going to give you any food. Those guys aren't even in your hands yet. I mean, they were really looking out for self. Now, guys, here, this is an incredible picture for us. When it comes to the brethren, we're to make sacrifices. We're to, even at our own cost, we're to be giving so that we're assisting one another in this journey that we're on. And what's incredible is these guys were more concerned about their own self-preservation than they were about even their brethren's preservation. Now, they were exhausted. And I remember Pastor Chuck always encouraging us. Every time we go to a pastor's conference, he'll say, you know what, you should never be burnt out in the ministry. You should never get to the point where, because if you're burnt out in the ministry, that means that you're doing it in your own power. You're doing it in your own strength. If you're at the point of burnout, then something's wrong. Now, it doesn't mean you don't get exhausted doing ministry, but you never get burnt out of the ministry. There's two different things there. I mean, there's a time where I, just burning my last ounce of fuel, you're just kind of like, I'm tired. We've been working on this construction thing for the last month, and we're just, I'm going, babe, when we're done, you'll see me again. We'll get there. And something, that's, you just burn both ends of the candle trying to accomplish a task or to get to a certain place, but there's never this place where you're burned out of doing what God's asked you to do, if you're doing it in His strength and in His power, not in the flesh. And it's interesting, these guys were exhausted, and they're going, man, we just need to be refreshed, we need to be nourished. And these guys go, you know what, we're not going to help. He goes, you know what, when we come back, after we take these guys down, I'm going to drag you across the desert floor, and you're going to get every pica and every cactus stuck in you because of it. Right? He wasn't as gracious with these guys. He was a little more harsh. Well, watch, here it goes. Verse 8. And he went up from there to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. These are also brethren. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. So he also spoke to the men of Penuel, saying, when I come back in peace, I will tear down this tower. Now Zebah and Zalmunna were at Karkor, and their families with them, about 15,000 all who were left of all the army of the people of the east, for 120,000 men who drew the sword had fallen. And Gideon went up by the road of those who dwell in tents in the east of Nobah and Jogbeha, and he attacked the army while the camp felt secure. And when Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them, and he took the two kings of the Median, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army. And Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from battle from the ascent of Heres, and he caught a young man of the men of Succoth, and he interrogated him, and he wrote down for him the leaders of Succoth and its elders, 77 men. And he came to the men of Succoth, and he said, here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you ridiculed me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hands, and we should give bread to your weary men? Now, I love it. He goes and he gets those guys. He brings them back alive. He says, were these the guys you were talking about that I didn't have in my hands? Well, here they are, guys. And you wouldn't even assist me. Now, this is the crazy thing, is that the men of Succoth would also benefit if the Midianites were taken out. But they weren't willing to make any sacrifices on their own. And I thought, man, what a great picture. The body of Christ. We're all in this together. We're all fighting for the kingdom. We're trying to stay the course. And we need each other to do that. And some within the body think, you know what, I'm not going to do anything that's going to cost me anything in order to keep this battle going or to help assist those that are in the battle. And, it just becomes this incredible picture for us is, these guys weren't faithful with what they could do. And if everybody within the body would be faithful with what they can do, with what God has given to them, the gifts, the talents, the resources that God has given each of us, man, we can accomplish great things for the kingdom. But there's those who are like, man, that's going to cost me something. I'm going to have to give a couple hours. I'm going to have to, make some kind of sacrifice. I'm going to have to do something, and I'm not really willing to do that. And these guys of Succoth were those guys. And Gideon comes back and says, look what God's done. You guys missed out. Not only did you miss out on what God's done, here's the 2 chumps that you said I wouldn't catch. And now what? And he gets them. I love this. These guys are cool. Watch this. And he came to the men of Succoth. He said, here are Zebah and Zalmunna, and whom you ridiculed me, saying all that are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your weary men. And he took the elders of the city. Remember, he had caught one of the kids. He says, who are the elders of that city? And he gave him a list of all 77 men. He found the elders of the city, and thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth. He goes, he taught them a lesson. I don't know what that looked like, but I can imagine. It says that he got the wilderness and briars, thorns of the wilderness and briars. I'd imagine he, tied their toes to the horses and just drug them across the briars. Something is like, teach you guys to not trust the Lord, to not do what God's asked you to do. He took it as being treason. Because think of this, if Gideon didn't win this battle, then the whole nation was affected. The Midianites would have gained power again. And then they would have been oppressed again. And Gideon says, man, you guys need to learn a lesson. And he taught them. Now, it says he took the elders of the city, thorns and wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth. Verse 17, and he tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. Now, he went in, and just like he said, and we'll tear down the tower. It seems that there was a rebellion trying to save their tower, and Gideon wiped out some of those guys. And he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, what kind of men are they whom you killed at Tabor? And they answered, as you are, so were they. Each one resembled the son of a king. Trying to give him a compliment. The guys I killed at Tabor, they look just like you. They were awesome guys. And he said, yeah, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had let them live, I would not kill you. And he said to Jether, his firstborn, rise and kill them. But the youth would not draw his sword, for he was afraid because he was still a youth. So Zebah and Zalmunna said, rise yourself and kill us. For as a man is, so is his strength. And so Gideon rose and he killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on their camels' necks. Interesting insight here. He confronts these guys. Did you guys happen to kill some guys that look like me? Those are my brothers. And now you're going to die. And he tries to get his son to kill him. The youngest son. Now, what's interesting is these kings didn't want to die by the hand of a kid. And this kid would have gotten great honor. He was the guy who killed, the kings, but he was afraid to do it. And then they kind of taunt Gideon a little bit, and Gideon gets up and he just did it. Just took him out. But it's interesting that he mentions that they had crescent ornaments on their camels. It was the worship of the moon god. And that is an ancient religion. Even before, there's others who have adopted that same symbol. The Arabs today, in Muslim countries, what's their symbol? The crescent moon. And what's fascinating in this whole picture is that Gideon comes in and he's wiping out those that were oppressing. And it all had to do with idolatry, the worship of Baal. You see, once you give yourself over to idolatry, you start to worship things or objects or created things that, you become slaves to them. You become oppressed by them. And here, they're finally freed because they cried out to the Lord. The only way you and I can be freed from the things of this world, because it has a grip on us. Just our sin nature longs for the things of this world. It's just what's ingrained in us because of the fall. And it's only when you cry out to the Lord that you can be freed from those things. There's no other way to do that. You can't just go, I'll just stop drinking, or I'll just stop doing this. But the problem is that you'll stop that, but then you'll do something else. You just change vices. But it's only the Lord who can deliver you, who can forgive you, who can cleanse you, and who can empower you to have victory over the enemy. There's no other way to do that. And so it's amazing is that, Gideon gets to this place, he wipes out these guys, he makes things right. And verse 22 is an interesting section here. Watch what it says. And the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, both you and your sons and your grandsons also. For you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. Now remember earlier, God knew that if 30,000 men won this battle, then they would take the credit for it. And so God says, now 10,000, that's still too many. Let's get down to 300 so that they would have to know that it was God. But even after all of that, they want to accredit Gideon with the victory. And there's the danger, guys, for all of us. When God uses us, that and others acknowledge, oh, look what God's done. And they want to give the credit to the person rather than to God. That's a dangerous thing. God doesn't share his glory with no man. Anything that happens good is because God did it, not because man did it. And they're trying to give Gideon the credit. And Gideon acknowledges. And I think it was because Gideon knew who he was. When God called him, he was hiding. He knew it wasn't because he was, some great warrior. He knew it wasn't because he was some brave heart. It wasn't because he had some, great power that he possessed. He knew, man, I was a knucklehead. I had nothing. And God did the work. And so Gideon had no desire to take the credit for what God had done. I don't think that's why God chooses the foolish. people of this world to do his work. Because then you can't go, look what I did. You have to look what God did. You can't think that it was you. And so God gives, I think, Gideon wisdom here. Look at verse 23. And Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my sons rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. Well, I appreciate that about Gideon. You know, he's like, you know what, we're not going to start a dynasty here. I'm not going to be the king and then pass down that reign to my son and then to my grandson, start some rulership. Now, when Israel started asking for a king, when we get to the book of 1 Samuel, we'll see that they became discontent with Samuel ruling over them, and then Samuel's son's going to rule over them as a judge, not as a king. And they started seeing all the other nations building armies and doing all of these exploits, and the children of Israel going, hey, we want a king. And Samuel goes, you don't want a king. The king's a bad thing. Let God rule over you. But they kept insisting on having a king. And Samuel goes to God. And he says to him in 1 Samuel chapter 8, and I just want to read this section, verse 6, he says, the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they've rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Guys, the problem with having a king is that God was supposed to be the king in your life. It was supposed to be a theocracy. God ruling. God in charge. God's the one who's in control, not man. And the nation of Israel was designed so that God would be the one who they seek after for wisdom and counsel and direction, instruction. But once you put a king in place, now that king starts to enforce his will over the will of God. And it's so much easier to have a king. Because someone just, is telling you what you can and can't do. But to have God, man, where you have to build a relationship and you have to be willing to live according to his will rather than to man's will. And it's always God's intent to have a theocracy in our lives. He wants to rule over you. He wants to be the one on the throne. But we can choose something else to sit in that position. And I thank God that Gideon was able to see through that. And he goes, you know what, I'm not going to rule over you. My kids aren't going to rule over you. Man, the Lord should rule over you. He should be the one who you seek after, who you want to please, the one who you surrender your life to. I mean, that God should be the one to do that, not man. And so he lays out for them that this is how it's supposed to be. And then verse 24, they're wanting to honor Gideon for everything he had done. And then Gideon said to them, I would like to make a request though. Each of you would give me the earring from his plunder. For they had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, we will gladly give them. And he spread out a garment, and each man threw into his earring from his plunder. And the weight of the gold earring that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments, the pendants, the purple robes, which were on the kings of Midian, and besides the chains that are around the camels' necks. Now, the estimation is between 45 and 75 pounds of gold that was offered to Gideon. And Gideon takes that. And watch what happens. It's interesting. And Gideon made it into an ephod. and he set it up in the city of Ophrah, not Oprah, don't forget. Ophrah. And all of Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon and to his house. Now, I think the intent of Gideon at the beginning may have been sincere. You know, think about what he had created, an ephod. The ephod is what the high priest would wear. And it was in order to discern the will of God. So when you had a question, you go to the high priest and, it's something that you needed answered. It would be the king or the judge or someone. And they would ask the question, God, do we do this or do we do this? And the ephod would give them the direction. It was that God was speaking to men. And it was quite possible that Gideon, God, for a long time, God hadn't spoke to us. And so I'm going to put an ephod as a remembrance that God spoke to us. And God worked. But that ephod became a stumbling block. They began to worship the ephod rather than the Lord. They played the harlot with the ephod. And every time God uses that term, that they played the harlot, they went whoring after. The whole picture is that we're in a relationship with God, just like a marriage relationship. And it's to be exclusive between you and God. You can't worship God and worship something else. It's to be a monogamous relationship between you and God. But once you start to put other things in that place where you begin to worship it, it begins to dictate your life. It begins to control your decisions. It begins to, make the course that you take because of this thing or that thing. That becomes an idol. And you can elevate it to a place where it actually is competing with God. That can happen in so many different areas. That can be a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a husband, a wife. It could be a job. It could be, success. It could be money. I mean, anything you put where this is making my decisions for me, not God. And it had become a place of stumbling for the children of Israel. They were actually looking to the ephod rather than looking to the Lord. And I think Gideon's failure is that when he acknowledged that was happening, he didn't melt it down. He didn't go and say, you know what, we're not going to look to an ephod for direction. We're going to look to the Lord for direction. We're not going to let this dictate, how we live or what we do or what course we take. We're going to look to the Lord to do that. And all the relics that man puts, in place of God. It's idolatry. And God acknowledges here that it was something that caused Gideon to stumble. It caused him and his whole house to veer from what God desired for him. And it would have great consequences. Look at verse 29. And we get to the end, Gideon in his retirement years here. Then Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. That's Gideon. And Gideon had 70 sons who were his offspring. You think 70 sons, man, that wife was busy. No, he didn't just have one wife. He had multiple wives. Again, what's he doing? He's veering from God's word. God had told them not to accumulate wives for themselves. It was clear in the scripture that was, but what's interesting is, Gideon decides, I got an ephod and, now I'm good. And now I can do what I want to do. And anytime we start to veer from the word of God, what God declares, And we start to say, well, at least I go to church, but I can fornicate, or I can have an adulterous affair, or I can lie and cheat and steal or whatever. You start to justify, because I'm doing one thing I'm supposed to be doing, but now I can justify all the other things I'm not doing that God's declared. And God had told them that they weren't to do this, and he didn't listen. Somewhere along the line, he got snared. He got caught up in the lie. He had many wives, it tells us at the end of verse 3. He had many wives. Now, the reason, men in that day only had one wife is because it was expensive to have more than one wife. One wife's expensive. But you have, think about you got how many households do you have? This guy's got 7, now it says 70 men. I mean, how many kids did he have? That's just the boys. They didn't even count the girls. This guy was supporting many homes, lots of households, feeding lots of mouths. And obviously he was pretty well to do. And what's incredible is that he wasn't just content there. And this is what happened when sin starts to take hold. You're not just content. He's got many wives. He's got over 70 kids. But that wasn't enough. Look at verse 31. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name is called Abimelech. We'll get into Abimelech in chapter 9. Not good. Now, a concubine wasn't a wife. She was his sidekick. That was just for pleasure. You see, once you start to get wrapped into sin, man, it just puts its tentacles in every part of your life. And now he's not content with many wives. Now he needs an affair. He needs another woman to satisfy his sexual desires. And it just spiraled. And I look at Gideon here, and I would say he was so far from what God desired for his life. The consequences would be grave. We watch Abimelech. He's not a good kid. Causes great problems for the nation of Israel. And rather than being a blessing, he actually becomes a distraction. And you watch this whole thing play out. Now, we kind of get the rest of his name. It says, the rest of his story, verse 32, Gideon, the son of Joash, died at an old age, buried in the tomb of Joash, his father, in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. And so it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals, made Baal Berith their god. And the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hand of all of their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal Gideon in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. It lasted for a little while. But they went right back into their same habits, to their same bondage, right back into Baal worship. And you read the book of Judges, and you can get depressed. You're just kind of like, these guys are such knuckleheads. They go and do the same thing over and over, and then you got to look in the mirror. And you go, man, how many times do I do that very same thing? I know what God says. I know what God's word says. And then I go and do the same thing that God had delivered me from before. And there's some warnings here for all of us, guys. That we would learn those lessons. Walking with the Lord, it's always a challenge. There's always obstacles. There's always things that will try to trip you up. But man, if you keep your eyes affixed on Christ and what He's accomplished for you, you can finish this race with endurance. You can hear the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant," when it's all over. And really, may that be kind of the target that we're aiming for. When it's all said and done, I want to hear, "Well done. You did what I asked you to do." Not perfectly, but you stood the course. You didn't go too far to the left or too far to the right. You kind of read the end of Gideon's life and you go, "Wow, what a bummer." What a bummer. That he could have had such a greater impact. He could have lived such a better end of his life for the kingdom. He could have set a better example for the next generation. But he allowed his flesh to veer him. And there's only two places you and I can walk. Guys, you're either going to walk in the flesh or you're going to walk in the Spirit. Galatians 5 tells us, the lust of the flesh. And he gives the long list of things that our flesh wants. And then he says, but if you're led by the Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, kindness, self-control. There's a whole different character that's produced when you're walking by the Spirit and allowing God to have His way in us. And it's just an incredible picture. You look at Gideon, so strong for so long, and then he succumbs. He's snared into these things. And it's just a crazy thing how, man, we're all susceptible.